I arrived at my own hotel and they wouldn't let me in. They said there were no rooms available and their eyes were full of doubt. I didn't argue. I just made a phone call. And everything changed. It wasn't a fight for a room. It was a fight for my right to be where I was supposed to be. And I wasn't going to let them doubt me, even if I owned the building. I didn't plan for things to be different this time. I was confident I would get into my hotel without any questions. My hotel, my chain, my rules. Everything was supposed to go according to plan. But when I stepped into the Oakwood Hotel in St. Louis, which belonged to me, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The lobby was quiet, almost empty, with no crowds. But the atmosphere changed as soon as I approached the front desk. The young woman behind the desk, who didn't even seem to notice who I was, looked at me with a strange expression. Her eyes showed neither respect nor understanding. She just looked up and said, "I'm sorry, we're full. We only serve registered guests." I paused for a moment. Was I outraged? No, I was just surprised. The hotel owner, who seemed to be the only person in the room who had a right to be there, and I couldn't go any further. And when she spoke, I felt the same thing I had felt many times before. It was the realization that I didn't fit into their idea of who had a right to be in such a place. The young woman's gaze clearly said, I didn't look like a hotel guest should look. My reaction was calm. I didn't start yelling or causing a scene. I was tired of that. I just smiled and said, "No problem. I probably made a mistake. Give me a couple of minutes." And turning away, I took out my phone. That feeling came back again, the same feeling I had felt before, when I was taking my first steps in business and was forced to prove my worth over and over again, even when my name was already on all the contracts. None of them knew who I was. And that didn't surprise me anymore. They couldn't see who I was. But I was ready to give them a chance to understand. I dialed the number. It rang for only a few seconds, but it was such an important moment for me. I didn't ask for permission. I wasn't here to beg. I was here to remind people that I wasn't just a guest. I was the owner. And when I said that it was my name, that it was my place, I knew that everything would change. Instead of anger, I felt a sense of inner peace, even though I knew I would have to prove the truth once again. The young woman at the counter looked at me again, but now there was an indefinable change in her expression. She shook her head, as if analyzing whether I was really who I said I was. A few seconds later, she began typing something on the computer, looking uncertain. "I don't see your reservation," she muttered. Once again, I was overcome by that familiar feeling of hostility. I remembered the moment when I first had to prove my worth in business. It seemed like a long time ago, but that moment remained with me. Today, here, I was back in the same place. I was being tested. I was not being treated as an equal. And it was no longer just a feeling of injustice. It was a daily pain when your value is determined not by what you have achieved, but by what others consider you to be not enough to be here. "It's okay," I replied softly. "You always have a number reserved for me. Please find it." Uncertainty flashed in her eyes. She ran another search on the computer and nodded to confirm that I was being pushy. I already knew that it wasn't really a mistake. She simply couldn't imagine that someone like me had the right to be there. A few minutes later, I noticed a new character appear, a middle-aged man holding some papers and trying to look professional. His eyes barely glanced at me, but they clearly showed that he understood who I was. However, there was still uncertainty in his behavior, as if he didn't know how to react. "Good evening, Miss Smith. Is there a problem with your reservation?" he asked, addressing me. I didn't answer right away, realizing that this wasn't just a booking issue. It wasn't just a question of a room. It was a question of respect. It was a question of my place in this world. And I was ready for them all to understand that. I wasn't going to make a scene, and I wasn't planning on getting into an argument. My strength was in my calmness. I was ready to prove that dignity doesn't depend on who recognizes you, but on who you really are. When the man with the paper and the stern look approached the counter, I slowly looked up. He was clearly trying to appear calm, but I could see how nervous he really was. He looked me over, as if waiting for a reaction, and then said, "Ms. Smith, I'm sorry for the inconvenience. We'll fix everything right away." I didn't promise him an easy ride. No, I didn't want to punish him or be harsh. But I had the right to be. And I had long since realized that sometimes the strongest message is simply action without words. I left him with his questions and went back to my phone. I didn't need to get into an argument or try to prove anything on the spot. I had already made up my mind. I'd had enough of people coming and rejecting me because I didn't fit into their idea of who had the right to be in such a place. I know who I am. She picked up the phone and said what needed to be said. We'll figure it out, Diana. Stay where you are. It was only a few seconds. I didn't have to explain who I was. I didn't have to convince them that it was my property, that my name was on the door and on every document. I simply stated my position, and that was enough. That was all it took to make them act. A few minutes later, the man returned to me. I could see immediately how he had changed. He was no longer so calm, and there was a new tone in his voice. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Smith. It seems we didn't quite understand the situation," he said, pronouncing my name clearly again and again, as if trying to make it sound more believable. "We'll write you a number." I didn't rush, as usual, and didn't raise my voice. Waiting calmly, I gave him a chance to resolve the situation. And only when I saw him start to get nervous when he noticed me again did I realize that he understood. He wasn't just dealing with a random guest. I was here as the owner of this place, and he would have to accept that. The girl at the counter, who just a few minutes ago had tried to push me away, now looked at me with different eyes. Her hand, which had been sliding steadily across the keyboard, suddenly stopped. She saw my name in the system, and now her expression was no longer uncertain. But what annoyed me the most was how easily they forgot that I, a person with different skin, simply wasn't supposed to be on their level. They forgot my story. And again, I had to look them in the eye and remind them, without words, without anger, without tears. Just remind them who I am and let them understand. While the man began to write down my details again, I turned around and saw several guests approaching the counter, all just as calmly, without addressing me, without mistrust. How many times had this happened? How often had I had to deal with people I called partners not treating me as an equal? How often had I had to change their perception of me? I felt an emotional storm building inside me. It seemed like it was all over, but for some reason, the echo of that feeling lingered. All those moments when I was always a random guest, when even my name wasn't enough for me to be accepted. Maybe I tried to stay calm, but my heart was beating faster, and I felt that this was not just a phone call, not just an attempt to get a number. This was the moment when I had to decide how I was going to act. And even if they eventually decided to sort out their mistakes, I wasn't going to let it go. "Write down the number," I said calmly but firmly. It wasn't just a request. It was an order that I no longer wanted to explain. I knew my worth. Yes, I had a right to be there. And even if they didn't always realize it, I was no longer willing to stand by while they treated me like a guest instead of an owner. As I waited, I felt the temperature in the room rise. My presence was changing the atmosphere. Every movement, every glance, everything felt like I was an intruder, disrupting the peace that the employees here were used to. I could see their tension, their attempts to maintain control, but their eyes were becoming increasingly uncertain. They saw me and thought one thing: I wasn't what they expected me to be. When I looked at the man named Neil Dorrance, I realized that he wasn't just an administrator. He was part of this system that had learned to ignore me. He didn't see me as the person who had built this place with my own hands. He didn't see me as the owner. I was just another wrong customer. So I looked at him straight in the eye and said, "We understand each other, don't we?" He stopped, looking up nervously. His face turned red, but he didn't dare bring up the reservation or any other formalities again. This wasn't just another mistake in the system, it was a mistake in perceiving who had the right to be there and who didn't. Only when I heard him finally ask if there was anything else I needed, did I realize that the moment had come. I could have called management again, and there could have been even more misunderstandings, but I didn't want to do that. My goal was not to get compensation or to punish anyone. I wanted one thing: for them to see the reality of my presence, for them to stop questioning my right to be there. "No, it's fine," I replied, looking him in the eye, "but I don't want to see this happen to others anymore. My presence should not be a surprise. And when I come back here, I don't want to be an uninvited guest. I want you to see me right away." Hearing this, he nodded silently and returned to the system to resolve the situation. It seemed like the moment when they finally began to realize that they were not dealing with a guest, but with someone who was responsible for their success. I wasn't going to wait for their attitudes to change, but that moment was important because it was when they began to understand their mistakes. I watched as new figures appeared in the lobby a few minutes later, two men in suits. They moved confidently, as if they didn't want to miss anything that was happening. Their eyes met mine, and what I saw in them was not just awareness of who I was. It was fear, the realization that the situation had become too serious to ignore. "Good evening, Miss Smith," one of them said again. His tone was warm but with a hint of panic. "We just received word that the situation with you has been resolved, and we want to make sure you have everything you need." "Yes, I have everything I need," I replied, calmly aware that the confidence had drained from their faces. They tried to show that everything was under control, but I could feel their anxiety still lingering in the air. They tried to turn the situation to their advantage, but it was obvious that things were no longer the same as they had been before. But even when I got everything I needed, the room key, confirmation that my room was ready, I knew it wasn't over. For me, it wasn't just a battle won over a room. It was a battle for my place here, for my dignity. And I won't let any hotel treat me like a random guest ever again. I got up without saying another word. I walked back to the elevator, and the air around me felt even heavier. Maybe it was a victory, but in reality, it was just the beginning. They had to understand that my right to be here wasn't a question of what I had. It was a question of what I deserved. And when I entered my room, I felt the weight of the experience, but I also realized one thing. I was ready to go back and prove it. Again. Morning. If I were a regular guest, if I had come here to relax or forget about the hard times, this day would have been just another visit to a hotel. But I wasn't just a guest, and today had a different purpose. I woke up early, feeling calm but tense at the same time. This wasn't just a day to recover. This was the day I was going to change this place, make it understand who I am and what I mean. When I stepped out of the elevator, the lobby was almost empty. Small groups of guests tried not to pay attention to my appearance, but I felt how everything had changed. Everyone suddenly fell silent. Everything seemed to freeze, and even the atmosphere of the hotel, familiar and welcoming, changed. I walked into a small meeting room next to the reception desk. It was a place for meetings. I knew that everyone who was supposed to be there was already waiting. The director, managers, HR. I was sure that this time I would not leave anyone indifferent. Each of them had to answer for their actions, even if they had not intended to hurt me. But their attitude towards me could not just be forgotten. I was here to change that. Manager Brent and District Manager Carlos stood in the corner, looking at me with curiosity, as if waiting for me to speak. But they didn't know how to prepare for this meeting. I stood with my hand on the table, looking calmly at each of them. There was no need to say much. My calmness, my silence, that was my main strength. They had to be ready to understand that from now on, everything would be different. "Let's talk about what happened yesterday," I began, keeping my voice calm but determined. "I want to hear it from you." No one answered right away. Everyone was in a state of mild shock, trying to collect their thoughts. I didn't need panic. I didn't need aggression or anger. I needed dialogue, and I wanted them to hear me. The first to speak was the girl working behind the counter. Her name was Kayla. She was probably one of the youngest here. Her eyes immediately darted to the floor as soon as she realized that I was the one who had to give her an answer. I didn't think you. Well, I didn't expect you to be the owner." Her words were trembling. She tried to explain, but her words sounded empty, as if she didn't believe what she had just said. I didn't answer right away. I looked at her calmly, giving her a chance to say more than she had just uttered. Her doubts were not accidental. They were the result of a system that had shaped her perceptions. And now that system was standing before me, right before my eyes, and it could no longer remain in place. "What exactly did you not expect?" I asked quietly, but with a clear emphasis on the last words. Her shoulders flinched, and she seemed to take a step back. All eyes in the room turned to her. This was the moment when she had to decide whether she wanted to continue defending her beliefs or whether she was ready to admit her mistakes. The young manager, Neil, couldn't leave the situation unresolved. He quickly apologized. "It was inappropriate. We had to sort out your reservation." But his words lacked the confidence I expected to hear. "Yes, but what?" I asked. What else was there to resolve? I just wanted to be here, in my own hotel, without any questions. I could feel my heart starting to beat faster, but it wasn't anger. It was more stubbornness. I wasn't going to let this happen again. No one answered right away. I could see that everyone in the room felt the same tension I was carrying. They knew the moment had come, and if they didn't realize it now, nothing would change. Finally, Brent, One of the managers stepped forward and said, "We will listen to your comments, Diana, and we will do everything we can to ensure that this does not happen again." His tone was firm, but it no longer had the confidence it had before. Now he was ready to take action. "I want you to understand, this isn't just about a room or a hotel. It's about how you see me, and how you see others you might not expect to see in places like this. My goal isn't to get an apology. My goal is to change this so that no one else ever feels the way I feel right now," I replied, looking at each of them. Those standing in front of me began to understand that today would not be just another correction. It was a challenge for them to understand who really belonged in these places. I didn't expect instant change from them, but for the first time in a long time, I felt that true repentance must be more than just words, but concrete actions. And that's what I demanded of them. The meeting ended. I left the conference room, ignoring the whispers and murmurs that I could hear echoing through the hall. But I didn't pay any attention to that. All I felt was the heavy realization that I had done everything I could, and now there would be consequences. Not for me. For them. I didn't want to defeat them. I wasn't here to punish them. My goal was simple, to make them see that there are people who cannot be ignored, who cannot be put in a position where their presence doesn't matter. And that lesson, if they want to learn it, will be a hard one for them. I hoped they would change, but whether they do is entirely up to them. That same morning, after the meeting, I received an official report on disciplinary measures from Carlos, my manager. It included everything: an investigation of the incident, recommendations for staff training, and even a personal apology from Kayla, the girl at the front desk. I looked at it, but I didn't feel any joy or satisfaction. I didn't need to receive those letters. I didn't need to see those reports. I had already seen the change in their eyes. And that was more important than any written documents or reports. They understood. And that was the first step. When I left the hotel that morning, I felt lighter. Easier because I knew that everything I had done here was not just a moment of truth. It was a moment of change. I was calm, and they were deep in thought about how they had made such a mistake. My presence here was important not only to me. It was a lesson for each of them. On my way out, I ran into the same doorman who had opened the door for me yesterday when it all started. Now his face wasn't so carefree. He greeted me with respect. It was casual, but definitely more cautious. "Have a good trip, Miss Smith," he said, holding the door open for me. It was a simple but very important acknowledgement, and I knew it was genuine. I didn't look back as I got into the car. I didn't need to look back. Nothing in that hotel mattered anymore. I left everything that had been yesterday behind me. My rights had been confirmed, and I could move on. The road to the airport was quiet. The driver didn't try to strike up a conversation. Only the soft sound of the wheels on the asphalt and the glare of the lights outside accompanied me to the end of this part of the journey. And although I didn't pay attention to it, I still began to feel that this was a moment for myself. A moment of realization that the changes I wanted had already become a reality. Not through big speeches or loud calls for change, but through quiet but irreversible actions. When I received a message from my assistant that everything was set up and changes would be implemented across all corporate sites, I was no longer worried. I was confident that these changes were not just on paper, but also in the culture that was now being created. At the end of my journey, as I sat on the plane, I glanced at my phone and saw another letter. It was a short note from Kayla, the girl who once doubted my right to be there. She wrote, "Miss Smith, thank you for your patience. I will be better." I smiled. That letter wasn't for me. It was her path to change. Whenever you encounter moments like this, you can't always be sure that everything will change right away. But real, profound change doesn't come from rewards or punishment. It comes through self-understanding and realizing who you really are. And that even in places where you might be ignored, you always have the right to be where you deserve to be. My presence was not an accident. I was where I belonged. And that truth stayed with me. It was a lesson, not just for the hotel staff. It was a lesson for anyone who doubts themselves, who may have been forced to prove their worth too often. But most importantly, it was a lesson for me. I am no longer going to prove who I am. I know it, and I am moving on.